Hey everyone, I'm your host Cadence, and welcome back to another episode of Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults, by a young adult, to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. Hey! I'm glad you're all here to join me for another episode of Project Honesty. If you haven't already, go check out last episode called True Beauty Talk, where I discuss the negative consequences of beauty standards and how it affects women and girls. That is available on Spotify and YouTube. And like I always tell you guys, if you haven't already, go follow the Instagram, which is project_honesty24, to find out our weekly topics. So if you haven't seen it on there, this week's topic is about fast fashion. We're going to be talking about the pros and cons of the fast fashion industry. We're also going to be talking about the contributions this industry has made to the global economy. We're going to talk about the development of this industry in third world countries, the negative impact of cheap labor on the workers, so like child labor. We're going to talk about how this all benefits consumerism in the West and how cheap labor is a factor in Western consumerism. And then we're also going to discuss the negative environmental impacts that fast fashion has and go through some examples of how companies have tried to fix the environmental issues but didn't. And then at the end, we're going to go over some better alternatives to contributing to fast fashion. Now, I'm going to preface this episode by saying that I have been a contributor to fast fashion. And yeah, it comes with guilt. I have ordered off Shein. I have bought from places like H&M, Ardene's, Garage, Zara, all of that. You think about it. But I am an informed consumer. I am aware of the problems with purchasing from fast fashion, and I understand the footprint that I leave on the earth by purchasing from the fast fashion industry. Not everybody has the privilege to not contribute to the fast fashion industry. I do have that choice where I don't necessarily have to contribute to it. But sometimes, for convenience sake, I do contribute, but I am informed about what that decision entails for both the environment and social issues. So starting off with some pros and cons of this industry, some of the pros include cheap and affordable clothing for consumers to purchase. It's cheap for producers to produce this product. Fast fashion tends to go in fashion cycles, so it keeps up with the trends, but once a trend is over, it'll start producing something that is more on trend than the previous product. There is great variety of colors and styles and cuts, and it's easy to get your hands on. When you talk about the online section of fast fashion, you get cheap shipping, so companies that come to mind when I think of cheap shipping and cheap product are Shein and Temu. And overall, the pros of fast fashion is you can get a lot for very little. Now, I wish you guys could see my notes page that's sitting in front of me right now, so you might think, wow, that's a lot of pros. Well, here are the cons. This list is a lot longer, so I will generalize some of the things, but also bring some more detail into these cons. So the cons of the fast fashion industry include many things. It affects the livelihood of people in the third world, and sure, it provides them work, but at what cost? For what cost? A lot of child labor is used in this industry. There's a lot of low wages, which are non-livable wages. A study done by Earth.org found that workers in Bangladesh, India, and China are only making 1/5 of what they need to survive as a family per month. So out of the whole salary required to live, they're only making 1/5 of that. A lot of these workers in the fast fashion industry are overworked in dangerous and hazardous working conditions, and it's unhygienic. In these working conditions, they are subject to 14 to 16-hour days non-stop with no breaks. Some of the other cons of the fast fashion industry is exposure to toxic workplace materials. A study done by Green America studied the use of heavy metals in the manufacturing process of specifically polyester textiles. And over half of these textiles were manufactured with heavy metals like antimony, which is a possible carcinogen. And a lot of other clothes are manufactured with other carcinogens such as lead and cadmium. Cadmium is a big one. It's used in everything from zippers to really cheap jewelry. And a while ago, I actually saw a study on how cadmium is illegally used in jewelry that is then shipped to Canada from China. Because cadmium is very, very cheap to purchase. So a lot of companies will purchase cadmium instead of purchasing silver or like sterling silver or a safe metal, and use cadmium as a replacement, but it's actually really, really toxic to be exposed to raw cadmium. Another con about the fast fashion industry is that workers are often exposed to these materials without proper protection, and this results in cardiovascular and respiratory issues, and those issues are not uncommon in these workplaces and sweatshops. When talking about the environment, which I'm going to get a little bit more into later, the fast fashion industry and the textile industry in general contributes a significant amount to the global carbon emissions annually. That is around 8 to 10% of global carbon emissions coming from this industry. And the fast fashion industry uses a lot of electricity and land for their factories and sweatshops. And we talked about these chemicals, right? Well, there's a problem with runoff into local waterways of these hazardous chemicals and dyes, and it affects local drinking water. The fast fashion industry, as most of you know, is a huge contributor to the global trash crisis, with around 82,782,000,000 kilograms of clothes being sent to landfills per year to be burned. The value of these clothes is around $400 billion annually. So those are just some of the cons, and we'll get into those more in depth in a minute. When we talk and analyze how the fast fashion industry has impacted the global economy, there has been increased gross domestic product in a variety of countries because of this industry and because of how fast these items are being produced. A study done in 2019 predicted that $192 billion would be contributed to the global economy by 2030, specifically from this industry. Already, you're seeing the global economy rise because of this industry. But again, at what cost? So you might be wondering how these producers and manufacturers are producing these items so cheap. Well, the choice of where to produce these clothes is very meticulous. The highest density of fast fashion industry production sites occurs in India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and those are more of the leaders in the production. But China is the number one leader, but it's in production, but it also is the leader in distribution of these products and the materials. So China kind of rules the exportation of these items from the fast fashion industry, but at the root of it, it comes from places like Bangladesh and India and Vietnam. Why these countries? Well, manufacturers and producers choose these because they have skilled workers that are willing to work for anything to hopefully get themselves above the poverty line. There is an abundance of cheap material that is easy to access in these countries and easy to order, cheap labor, and cheap land, as well as very little labor laws. That is something I want to talk about because it is a big, big problem. So cheap labor, I think we all have a general understanding of what cheap labor is, but do you know the depth of cheap labor? That is the bigger question and the more important question. And so when it comes to how these workers are being paid, on the high end, like the high end average of a garment worker in Asia is around $200 per month. $200 per month. That is not a lot. And on the lower end, it can average around only $90 per month. So already these workers, as we know, are doing a lot of work and they are barely getting compensated for the work that they are doing. Why do companies choose to have cheap labor? Of course, it gives them lower production costs because more money can go into the product rather than the person making the product. And in lesser developed countries, there are fewer labor laws. So there is no regulations around if these workers get breaks during their work hours or how these companies and corporations are distributing the wage of these workers. And so there's a lot of wiggle room to kind of abuse and use these workers for their time and their money to keep on producing these garments at a faster rate. Obviously, this is going to have a really, really big impact, a negative impact on the workers. One of the biggest things is they work in an abusive and unsafe environment. It is not uncommon for these workers to face verbal and sometimes even physical abuse, especially if they ask to have a break. It is not uncommon for them to get verbally abused into doing more work. The wages, as we know, are unfair and unlivable, and for the amount of work they do, they shouldn't be compensated that little. They deserve more compensation. And so with this unfair and unlivable wage, this keeps a lot of workers and their families under the poverty line. When I say a lot, I mean 98% of the workers in the fast fashion textile industry are under the poverty line. 98% of these workers can't afford to live. They are socially and economically struggling. They cannot afford social services or healthcare, and they can't even afford basic necessities, so food, water, and shelter. So in a lot of these countries, especially Bangladesh, I saw this during my research, a lot of upsetting images where you see slums in Bangladesh that are created because these people cannot afford to live anywhere else, so they have to live in a slum and try to survive off of their minuscule wage. Child labor, we've all heard of child labor. We might think that, there's like rules, child labor, you can't use it anymore. Out of all garment laborers in the world, 60% of garment laborers globally are under the age of 18. So 60% of laborers in the fast fashion and textile industry are under the age of 18. They are children. The reason why a corporation might choose to use child labor is because it is easier to get away with not paying them at all for the same amount of work that, say, an adult in that industry would be doing. And so in third world countries, a lot of children have to work for their families. So it wouldn't just be like mom and dad going to work. It would also be child going to work. And in the same way that these adults are abused and overworked in the workplace, so are children. But these children aren't getting any compensation at all for the work and abuse that they are doing and tolerating. And that is really a big problem. When we take a look at Western consumerism, we see that cheaper prices equal more consumers, and the more consumers you have equal the higher and cheaper labor demand, plus the need for more product. When Western consumerism and reliance on fast fashion rises, the need for cheaper labor and labor such as child labor is necessary so that these producers can produce more product at a faster rate for lesser of a cost, for more profit for that company overall. As we know, and from personal experience, as a Western consumer, I love a deal. You notice that online outlets like Shein and Temu have massive deals that offer loads of product for very little price. An example of this that I know is that I went on a trip recently and I needed like cheap tank tops. So I went on Shein and I got 3 tank tops for $5. And that I felt guilty purchasing, but at the same time, that was a deal. So these enticing deals are incredible, but at what cost of the workers in underdeveloped countries? Again, it's all about being an informed consumer. And so when you're a Western consumer, you are benefited from this intense and unfair labor as it gives you product at a lower cost. But you have to consider what else is happening in the world socially, economically, environmentally when you make that purchase. Speaking of the environment, there is a lot of negative environmental costs that come out of the fast fashion industry. When we're looking at waste, as we discussed, over 82 billion kilograms of textile waste is produced annually. Most of this textile waste is sent to landfill to be burned. Companies such as Nike and H&M in the past have tried creating recycling programs for consumers to exchange their clothes for discounts and quote-unquote recycle their items in specialized bins that are located in stores. But CBC Marketplace tested and kind of busted these bins and found that most of the textiles that were supposedly recycled in these bins ended up in landfill anyways. They found that this is because the majority of materials, such as like denim and polyester, are nearly impossible to recycle. And when they are possible to recycle, it has negative impacts on the emissions produced in this industry. Emissions are another big one. So again, it's responsible for 8 to 10% of total carbon emissions in the world. That is more than the shipping or aviation industry. The aviation industry that burns tons and tons of fuel every single day has less emissions than the fast fashion industry. And according to the Fashion Transparency Index in 2023, it's a really good index to go look at. They have a bunch of slides, keep you informed. It's really cool to look through. But according to this report, only 43% of brands publish their annual carbon footprint. The Transparency Index is to promote the transparency of these brands and these companies to reveal how much their company is contributing to climate change through their greenhouse gas emissions. I talked a little bit about water and chemical runoff being a really, really big problem with the fast fashion industry. According to this Transparency Index, only 3% of brands globally publish their annual water footprint. Now you might be thinking, well, they're making clothes. Why would you need water? How much water is actually being used in this clothing production? A BBC study shows that it takes up to 10,000 liters of water to manufacture one pair of jeans. That's around 20,000 water bottles on one pair of pants. That is a lot of water. And so the fact that these brands rarely publish their water footprint makes me think that they're trying to hide something from us. When it comes to chemicals, around 43 million tons of chemicals are used in clothing production annually for processes like dyeing fabrics and so on. And only 30% of brands disclose their commitment to eliminate hazardous chemicals in their production. Less than half of these brands have publicly committed to eliminating these hazardous chemicals in the workplace to protect the workers in it. Like we said, antimony, cadmium, those are all hazardous chemicals that appear in a lot of fast fashion workplaces and sweatshops. And not a lot of brands are willing to admit that they use those in their production, and they're sure as hell not willing to admit that they want to eliminate them from those production lines. Land is also a thing you have to consider when thinking about the environmental costs of the fast fashion industry. For example, the production of synthetic materials such as polyester uses around 342 million barrels of oil annually just to produce that specific material. And the cotton production for the textile industry takes up around 2% of global farmland. But think about 2% of all farmland in the world, and that cotton production goes to the fast fashion industry. There are a lot of alternatives to stopping the purchasing of fast fashion industry items, but one of the best options you can have as a consumer is being an informed consumer. So if you recognize all the issues and problems environmentally and socially and economically with this industry, and yet you still decide to purchase these items, you at the very least, are being informed about how, say, that pair of jeans or that shirt has an impact on the world around you. And more sustainable clothing can come at a cost, so just be informed about how you are contributing to the fast fashion industry and the problems that come with it. So not only for the people, but also for the environment. Thrifting is a great alternative. I don't get to do it as often as I would like, but thrifting saves money because they come very cheap. There's a lot of variety, especially if you go to a giant thrift store, there's a lot. And it is recycled clothing. So the clothing is donated, comes in, they organize it, and there you go. Recycled clothing that can be brought back to life by you, the consumer. One of the biggest alternatives to the fast fashion industry is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Wear your clothes until you physically cannot wear them anymore. Repurpose old clothes into items such as quilts and washcloths. I know that my dad used to cut up old t-shirts and use them as cloths for the kitchen instead of purchasing more material to have washcloths. There are a lot of alternatives to this industry. I didn't go through a lot of them on here, but those are some of the main ones. But I want you to ask yourself, how do you contribute to the fast fashion industry? Do you know the impact that it has on the world? I hope you do now, based on this episode. And what are you going to do to reduce or eliminate your contribution to fast fashion? Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. And to keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24. We have a TikTok now, which is Project.Honesty. And to help spread this podcast everywhere, tell a friend or share with family about Project Honesty, and you can direct them over to the Instagram, the TikTok, the Spotify, or the YouTube to help them learn more. Subscribe, follow, and click the bell icon for updates when I post. And remember, the more listeners, the bigger the family.